Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday, I go over my best of one, best of three meta review for Standard. And so we're looking at week one of Foundations and what new things have Foundations brought to the format. And what I can say right now is that Foundations hasn't been a hugely impactful set, and that's sort of by design, right? So we haven't had a core set in quite some time, and they're extending the core into 2029. So they're going to keep the rotation every 3 years. They're going to move it into January instead of in September, and eventually down the road, I think next year, not this January. But the Foundations cards couldn't be ultimately that powerful if they're going to be around until 2029, right? We would get really tired of them if they were in every deck for the next 5 years. Now, that being said, there were some tools that were brought in that we are going to see kind of become staples, right? And so one of them is definitely going to be Burst Lightning. Land of War Elves is hopefully going to breathe some life back into green. But if you're expecting a huge change in the archetypes in Best of 1 and Best of 3, I will have to sadly report to you that there hasn't been a huge amount of change. Now, still lots to talk about, of course, though, and so we'll get started. And if this is your first time here, what I like to do is I like to use the Untapped Tracker to look at the top performing decks between Bronze and Mythic, and this way it is an informative podcast, if you will, and so it doesn't rely on my opinion. But I have been playing Magic the Gathering since Portal in 97, and hopefully can offer some insights since this is what I spend hours each day doing. So the Mono Red Aggro is still number one, the top of tier 1 in Best of 1. And if we compare this to last time I did the meta review, which was 2 weeks ago, which is the end of Duskmorn, we do see some changes, and this one is leaning towards the Screaming Nemesis version, which is what we saw in the World Championship. The top performing deck, the last time I was talking about it, was the one that was exploring Cunning Coyote instead of the Screaming Nemesis, which is a really good option if you are lacking the Mythic wild cards, right? Like if you're on a budget and you want to have a cheaper option, you know, you could definitely sub out the Screaming Nemesis for the Cunning Coyote, which is why I like to talk about the changes throughout the weeks. So the other changes that we see are the Blooming Blast got dropped, as well as the 4 copies of Shock, and we're running the 4 copies of Burst Lightning instead. And we have the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, which combos really well with the Screaming Nemesis, being able to shoot the Screaming Nemesis itself to deal 5 damage to your opponent. You can also use the Burst Lightning to shoot your Screaming Nemesis to prevent your opponent from gaining life, which can be a relevant line a lot of the time. We're also dropping 2 copies of the Demonic Ruckus. Excuse me. And since we are going a little bit higher up in the curve compared to the Cunning Coyote, which is a 2-drop, we're bringing in an additional mountain. And you may think that this looks a lot for this curve, especially with the discounted cost of the Witchstalker Frenzy, and that's because the Rockface villages don't really, they're not full lands. A lot of the times you're using this just as a repeatable way to trigger Valiant for your Heartfire hero, or even for Dig on the Emberheart Challenger. And so we've talked about Mono Red a lot throughout the weeks, but just in case you're coming back to Magic the Gathering for Foundations and it's been a long time, I also like to cover the matchups and kind of give you an idea of what you should be looking for in your opening hand. So Mono Red is favored against Boros Burn, which is a new archetype that hasn't been performing terribly well. It's favored against Mono Black Discard, largely Boros Auras and Rakdos Aggro is countered by Mono Black Discard. The advantage of playing Mono Red is that you can kind of extend some of your threats, and it doesn't suffer as much to the discard strategy through strategies like the Rockface Village, giving you something you can do even if you don't have a hand. It's also favored against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus, and it's weak to Boros Auras, Mono Black Midrange, and and as far as the opening hand goes, you should be, I think, trying to at least have one of these cards in your opening hand. That's been my strategy, at least, and that is to either have the Heartfire hero or the Hired Claw, right? You want to be starting on turn 1 in this archetype, and these are your best ones to do, just that. And then the Manifold Mouse, if you have the Heartfire hero, is especially nice with the turn 1, turn 2. So On to the next one. Number 2, according to Untapped from Bronze to Mythic in Tier 1 as well, is Boros Auras. And if we compare this one to the one I talked about last, we can see that they're going in a little bit of a different direction in this one. So we're bringing in 2 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear to have more targets to hit with our enchantments. It is a card that we have seen being played in the past, dropping the top end of the deck, which is the 2 copies of the Atali's Favor. And the general strategy has the same Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, but you're throwing in the Sheltered by Ghosts, which gives you that early ward. A lot of times you can play this without even having a target. You just don't want to play it if your opponent has untapped mana and can 2-for-1 you by removing your target that you're trying to enchant with your Sheltered by Ghosts. But once you get this down, it's very difficult for your opponent to deal with outside of like a cheap sweeper like Malicious Eclipse or Temporary Lockdown. And can be quite problematic. I guess Shieldred's Edict gets around it because of the sacrifice effect, but I digress. Feather of Flight here, giving you more enchantment synergies to enchant your guys and get damage in. And again, this is another one that we've covered a lot throughout the weeks, so not going to go through every single card. And it's favored against Boros Burn, Mono Red Aggro, Golgari Midrange, and Azorius Oculus. And it is weak to Mono Black Midrange and Mono Black Discard. And the opening hand is Heartfire Hero or the Sheltered by Ghosts. And Optimistic Scavenger. All right, number 3 is Selesnya Rabbits, and this is done by performance on the ladder, not by popularity. Selesnya Rabbits is your likelihood of bumping into this deck is quite a bit lower than Mono Red Aggro and Boros Auras as far as orienting yourself. This one is a fun strategy to do, though. It's been around since the Bloomburrow set. So we do see a slight change, not a very big one, dropping 1 Warren Warleader to bring in an additional copy of Phineas Ace Archer, kind of just pushing the curve down a little bit to adjust for the speed of the best of 1 meta, and dropping 1 Cavern of Souls to bring in a Plains. And there are a couple of cards like the Season of the Burrow and the Hop to It, where if you have a whole bunch of Cavern of Souls as your only sources of lands, you wouldn't be able to cast it. So I think we're, especially because we haven't seen a whole lot of counter spells in the meta, I think that's why we see this change this week. So this deck is favored against Boros Burn, Mono Black Discard, which is really trying to do that 1-for-1 attrition strategy. Since you're going wide, it punishes that strategy. And then it's a coin flip against Mono Black Midrange, and it's weak against Mono Red Aggro, Boros Auras, not having the interaction to disrupt their mice synergies. And as far as the opening hand strategy goes, the Valley Might Caller, again, this is a deck that wants to start on turn 1, so that and the Pop Hatch Recruit are good ones to have. And the Phineas Ace Archer is another one that is a very nice turn 2 to follow up to your Might Caller or your Pop Hatch Recruit. Number 4 is Mono Black Midrange, and just really quickly too, we may see some more Foundation-specific archetypes come in afterwards. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, like maybe next week we'll see a little bit more in the top 8, just because the people who have been performing quite well on the ladder are playing the strategies that are already figured out, and then taking advantage of everybody trying out the new strategies and foundations is quite common with a set being released. So if you are thinking about crafting one of these decks, I would hold off for at least till week 2, maybe even week 3, until we actually see the meta settle. Right, because there are some decks that we'll talk about here in a second that have been doing well, or at least look like they could become a solid tier 1 archetype. So Mono Black Midrange made it into tier 1, and so we're seeing a whole bunch of the decks that were in tier 2 kind of squeak up into tier 1, which is nice to see. And I think that's largely to do with a less competitive, more exploration-based meta. But anyway, this one isn't a new archetype, but it's a new archetype as far as being in the top 8. So I finally get to talk about Mono Black Midrange. And if there's an archetype that I'm not talking about, like, you can definitely go look it up on Untapped, right? So I'm just trying to bring you information as quickly as possible. So I'll stop rambling. Mono Black Midrange is basically the black core of the demon synergies that we saw take down #1 in Worlds. That they brought in Jace to bring in some mill synergies, as well as the 5 black demon to have an alternative strategy. But the base core of like Dimir Midrange and Golgari Midrange and the Dimir Demons deck has a lot of these tools, right? So you have classic midrange early interaction to disrupt aggro, Shieldred's Edict, nowhere to run, go for the throat, the 4 copies of Cut Down and Anoint with Affliction. Like, you can kind of play whatever you really want in your removal suite, right? So nowhere to run helps with the Sheltered by Ghosts. Same with the Shieldred's Edict. Also gives you a little bit of Planeswalker hate. Duress here to attack your opponent's hand, along with Liliana, helps up against the control matchups, which are less common in the best of 1 meta. And then we have the Unstoppable Slasher, which is a 1-turn kill if you turn 3 Unstoppable Slasher and then turn 4 Bloodletter of Aclazotz, and they get damaged by the Slasher, you just win, right? And then you have the Unholy Annex, which is a really great turn 3 followed by a turn 4 Archfiend of the Dross. You can also, this is also a demon, and then it itself for 5 creates a demon, and then you're getting that additional card draw while also draining your opponent for life instead of taking 2 damage a turn. So Unholy Annex has seen a ton of play and is just a really great card all around. And then you've got the Deep Cavern Bat here for a little bit of disrupting your opponent's hand as well. So if you haven't checked out the Mono Black Midrange deck, it's a little bit expensive to craft. There are definitely some mythics that are, bringing up the price of the deck. But if you've got the wild cards for it, it's been a fun strategy that's different than Heartfire Hero or Sheltered by Ghosts. And, so its matchups are, it's favored against Mono Red Aggro, it's favored against Boros Auras, which is, it's like the meta destroyer, right? It's favored against Boros Burn, and it's favored against Mono Black Discard. It's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange and Dimir Midrange, and it's weak to Azorius Oculus. And just in broad terms, right? And as far as the top performing opening hand cards go, is early interaction, which is why I don't think the removal is negotiable except for the 4 copies of Cut Down, at least in best of 1, right? So your top performing opening hand card is Cut Down, followed by Anoint with Affliction, and then Unholy Annex. And number 5, also in tier 1, and the tiers just mean like how many standard deviations above the average win rate are we talking about, right? So they're all statistically similar to one another. So the top 5 are all statistically comparable, right? Mardu Aggro is number 5 and is also in tier 1. And this week we do see some changes. The deck taking a little bit more of a turn towards Boros Auras and a little bit further away from Rakdos Aggro. So we're dropping 1 copy of the Callous Sellsword, which is, by the way, why it's called Mardu Aggro, even though we're not playing any black, is that it's a way to distinguish whether or not you're running the Burn Together and flinging your card at your opponent. So leaning further away from that because we're cutting out the Slickshot show-offs as well. And we're dropping 2 Monastery Swift Spears and to bring in the 2 additional copies of the Manifold Mouse, so leaning fully into the mouse trifecta that we have seen everywhere in Mono Red, and bringing in 4 copies of the Optimistic Scavenger that we usually see in Boros Auras, dropping the 4 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, and bringing in 1 copy of the Tali's Favor, which is usually what we see as the top end in Boros Auras, and bringing in the 4 copies of Feather of Flight, which is what we see in Boros Auras. And and then tweaking the lands to kind of reflect that. Notably, also playing some budget lands, so this one could just be a low sample size, so craft with care. I really like the Mardu archetype and ran the Slickshot show-off version for last season to get into Mythic, and I think the deck performs quite well. So we're dropping the 2 Battlefield Forges and to bring in the Plains and the Rockish Carnival, again, just probably for budget reasons rather than anything else. Whoop, almost forgot. It's favored against Boros Burn, it's favored against Mono Red Aggro, and then it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, and the opening hand is very similar to the Boros Auras, which is get your Sheltered by Ghosts or your Heartfire Hero. And number 6 in tier 2, so this one is performing worse than the other 5, is Rakdos Aggro. And there are a ton of decks in tier 2. We have a very diverse meta, and so I'll just talk about the top part of tier 2. And so Rakdos Aggro is at the top here, and we see a couple of changes happening in this one. Again, also could just be because of more budget options. We haven't seen the Codebreaker being ran over the Emberheart Challenger since the beginning of DSK, or it might have even been before that. It might have been Bloomborough. Anyway, whenever this deck, like whenever I did the Mythic in 4.5 hours, was running a 1 Codebreaker over the Emberheart Challenger. Oh, it was Bloomborough, because it was, I remember now, with the Emberheart Challenger. So anyway, we're going back to that. We're bringing the Emberheart Challenger up to 3 copies from 2, and we're bringing in the Fugitive Codebreaker. And to make room for it, we're dropping 2 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire. This one comboing. It's one of the tools that you can use to turn 3 your opponent by flinging the Slickshot Show-Off for 20 damage on turn 3. And if you're not familiar with it, you do a 2 power combat, 2 combat tricks that increase your power by 2. On top of the +2/+0 that you get the power to 9. You hit them for 9 damage. You then fling it with the Callous Sellsword. It gets +2 when you cast the fling. It hits them for 11. Totals of 20 damage on turn 3. And what's really nice too is that you can plot it on turn 2 so that they can't even kill it, so they have to keep up interaction on turn 3. Now again, if you've been playing Standard at all, you're very, very used to this situation already. The other thing too is Cacophony Scamp can hit for triple times its damage off of the Callous Sellsword, and has some interesting synergies. So this one's going back to the Blazing Crescendo. Again, that one we haven't seen for quite some time. Gives you additional dig, synergizes with increasing the power of your Scamp or your show off to deal damage. And interestingly, we're dropping the 4 copies of Turn Inside Out. And again, this one could just be because, we've only got less than a week of data that we're talking about right now, and we might see it come back. But for the time being, the one that decided to drop the Turn Inside Out and the Urbrask's Forge, which was the top end 3-cost artifact that kind of can help out against the mono black matchups. And instead is bringing in the 4 copies of the Bane Splitter. Again, this was one that we saw quite commonly before, which, it permanently increases the power of like your Heartfire hero to 4, so that if they do use interaction later, it still is kind of like already done its damage. So they're definitely both viable options, if you will. And this one is deciding to run the black mana of the Black Cleave Cliffs and the Sulphurous Springs. You do not need these. If you want to just run this strictly as mountains, you can definitely do that. And 17 or 18 lands is quite common. So this one is favored against Mono Red Aggro and Boros Burn and Azorius Oculus. Largely because eventually you're gonna get around your opponent's kind of limited interaction. Azorius Oculus has like the Elspeth Smites or Into the Floodmaw, where Mono Red Aggro has the Burst Lightning now instead of Shock, and the Lightning Bolt. Both that, like, eventually you can kind of get something through for a bunch of damage. It's a coin flip against nothing, and it's weak against. No, it's a coin flip against Boros Auras. Sorry, and it is weak against Mono Black Midrange and Mono Black Discard and Golgari Midrange, which have a plethora of interaction, like cut down and go for the throat, etc. To always have the mana up to answer your 1-turn kill. So the opening hand for this is Heartfire Hero, which is why you can see some people are really tired of this card. It has been dominating a lot of the best of 1 meta. Really, you're just trying to make sure you have your Heartfire Hero. The second card, looked it up, was the Monstrous Rage, and it's a little bit lower than your Heartfire Hero. Yeah, start on turn 1, roll your opponent over. Number 7, according to Untapped, is Azorius Oculus at tier 2. And we do see some substantial changes happening to kind of adapt this to a different meta. Largely the inclusion of the temporary lockdown in one of the tech slots really points to more of a rise in popularity of the Boros Auras strategy. And we see a couple of other changes, some of which I'm not 100% behind, and I'll talk through why. But again, to try to remove my bias, this is the top performing deck. And they dropped 2 copies of Chart a Course, and that's the one that I'm not 100% sold on, because this is one of your top performing cards in your opening hand, right? So being able to immediately discard one of your Jin or your Oculus to then turn 3 helping hand is kind of what this deck is all about. So I'm not sure about dropping the Chart a Course to 2 copies personally, but maybe I should try it out before I talk too much about how bad it is. So the other one too is they brought in the 2 copies of the Sleight of Hand, and this might just point to Bronze to Mythic as well, as that like people in the lower ranks tend to not mulligan and tend to not know what they should, when they should mulligan and not mulligan. And so that might be why this is performing better than Chart a Course. Just something to consider, right? And something to consider with all of these decks that I'm talking about, right? Like, this is also just to help you build your own best version, right? So this one's not running the Afara's Dispersal, which is the 1 blue bounce if they're attacking or tapped. This one's also not running Get Lost, which is a very popular pick, especially in best of 3. It's dropping Negates and Shore Ups and 3 Steps Ahead to bring in the Elspeth Smite. This still helps up against the mono red aggro. It's more important in best of 1 to have something like Elspeth Smite because of Heartfire Hero, and then the Exile effect makes it so that it doesn't deal damage to you. So Elspeth Smite's particularly nice against that effect. I think that along with the Temporary Lockdown also reflects that there's more just Boros Auras in the meta. And bringing in an additional copy of the Into the Floodmaw. This one's fine against mono red, but like eventually, you know, they do just replay what you bounce. So you really do want to make sure you get the 2-for-1 with your bounce effects. And then running the Phantom Interference instead of the 3 Steps Ahead, which I think is fine. It's still giving you some form of disruption and some way of preventing your protecting your targets once they're on the field, right? Like reanimating the Haughty Jin for it to then just get killed is lackluster. You can prevent that from happening by when you reanimate it on turn 3 with the Helping Hand or the Recommission. You can then have mana up to keep your Phantom Interference to protect your Haughty Jin, right? And Soul Partition is one that depends on how many problematic non-land permanents you're experiencing. So like mono black mid-range with the Unholy Annex. Being able to kind of bounce that to their hands so that they have to replay it was a good option for like Leyline of Resonance before that got banned, and kind of can also work just to get rid of the Heartfire Hero and like make them recast it at a more expensive after you've kind of stalled long enough to pull off your combo. And then I've already mentioned the Temporary Lockdown, particularly nice against the Boros Auras strategy and the mono red strategy. The Rakdos strategy and the Boros Auras strategy. Mono red has Screaming Nemesis, which doesn't get hit by the Temporary Lockdown and makes it a little bit worse in that matchup. As far as the lands go, we dropped the 3 copies of a Darker Waste to bring in, and Flood Farm Verge and a Sea Chrome Coast to bring in 1 copy of the Meticulous Archive, so bringing up that one to 3. 3 copies of Plains and Temple of Enlightenment, which is the 1 card from Foundations. It's a tap land that gives you a scry. So, woohoo! But that being said, there is some exploration happening in this archetype that will eventually come down the line that I want you to be aware of, right? So Unsummon and Opt fit this strategy relatively well, and I think we'll talk about them in best of 3. So I'll cover it then. So, or just next week when I imagine it will show up, because they've been performing quite well. So it's favored against mono black midrange, it's favored against mono black discard, it's favored against Golgari midrange and Dimir midrange, which are a lot more common in the best of 3 meta, right? Which is why this deck is, I think, performs better in best of 3 than it does in best of 1. It's a coin flip against Boros Burn, not really having a lot of interaction for just the direct damage that that deck is running with the Lightning Helixes and the Boros Charm. And it's weak against Mono Red Aggro, Boros Auras, and Rakdos Aggro, which are 3 very common archetypes in best of 1. So you're definitely going to want to maximize the tech in this with as much to fight those as you can, with the Temporary Lockdowns, the Elspeth Smites, etc. Right? So I'm not surprised that the tech choices that they did, they reflect the meta in best of 1. And then it's best opening hand the best cards in its opening hand are Chart a Course and Helping Hand. Kind of a no-brainer. Figure out, I think the third one or the fourth one was Picklock Prankster. Some way of being able to, like, enable your combo, and then the piece that actually lets you do the combo, right? All right, and then I usually keep this to 8 decks. The number 8 deck was Boros Prowess, also in Tier 2. And this one's a new archetype, if you want to call it that. Basically, it's running the Burst Lightning instead of the Shock, or in addition to the Shocks. And it's running the Boros Charm, which allows you to give the double strike to the Slickshot Show-Off, and then it's running the Sheltered by Ghosts. So this is taking like everything that is broken right now in in the best of one meta, the Slickshot Show-Off, the Heartfire Hero, and the Sheltered by Ghosts, and throwing them into one little package, right? And then you can also do this just for like direct damage, same with the Burst Lightnings, and yeah, pretty straightforward deck. Leaning further away from the enchantments than the Boros Auras, and leaning further away than the one-turn kill than the Rakdos Aggro with the Slickshot Show-Off, and performing worse than either. But it is an option, and I think that maybe it's a little bit too heavy to have both the Shocks and the Burst Lightnings. This is still in its infancy stage, so I can't really tell you what the matchup data is on this because it is so new. I can tell you, though, that Heartfire Hero and Sheltered by Ghosts are the cards that you're going to look for in your opening hand. That one is a no-brainer. And then, before we wrap up on Best of One, I just want to mention as well that Mono Black Demons, which is a new archetype that's focusing on executing the one-turn combo, or the one-turn kill off of Bloodthirsty Conqueror and Enduring Tenacity, or Starscape Cleric, however you want to start that infinite loop. That was number 9, and is definitely one to keep an eye on. I do think that there's at least maybe an Orsov combo deck, or a Mono Black combo deck that is being figured out right now, and it might not make it into the top 8, but time will tell. And then the number 10 was a mono white life gain deck that has the Essence Channeler and a bunch of the life gain Healer's Hawk and that sort of thing that we got in Foundations. Has a lot more Foundation specific cards. And then we also, there's like mono white Cats has been being explored, hasn't been making it into the top yet. And in my meta breakers that I talked about yesterday, there were some options that were exploring some more of the Foundation cards, like the Omniscience deck, right? The problem with those decks is that they are difficult to pilot, and they don't perform well across Bronze to Mythic, right? So it's not that there's a lack of creativity happening in Foundations. If anything, there's quite a bit of it, right? Like Kona being able to cheat in Atraxa, they're just not really, they're not very competitive decks, or they're difficult to execute to make them a top performing deck, right? Like CGB's Kona and Atraxa deck, right? Or the Omniscience deck by Sonio, right? Like people are definitely having fun with the new meta, and it just hasn't translated into a new archetype other than Boros Prowess making it into the top 8. But I don't think it's really doing that much in anything new. I guess Boros Charm is new, right? All right, and the other thing that I like to do each week is talk about Best of 3. And I found that the Untapped tracker in Best of 3 is a little bit slow to come up with, like what happens in the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online tends to happen on the Best of 3 tracker with a lag time, right? So it's just better to talk about the standard challenges in the Best of 3 meta. Since most of the Best of 3 meta will just reflect what the top winners of that tournament anyway. That's been my experience. There are some exceptions because the tournament meta is a little bit different than the Best of 3 ladder on Arena. But I'll try to kind of talk about how this deck performs on the Arena side of things as well, because most of you are probably not competing in the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, I would guess. Could be wrong. I bet some of you are. But anyway, let's talk about the deck. So this was number 1 on Friday, and was mono white token controlled by the Meat Man. Took down first place. And we see some changes to the archetype. So Lauren of the Third Path is being pulled here, as well as the 2 copies of Sanguine Evangelist. And instead we're running a 4th copy of the Enduring Innocence and bringing in the 1 copy of the Overlord of the Mistmoors, dropping 1 copy of Soul Partition, keeping the other 2, and bringing in 2 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty. And none of these are new changes. These are all just alternatives that we've seen in other mono-white token control decks throughout the weeks. And the upside to like Virtue of Loyalty is the instant speed 2/2 and then into kind of like more of a late game win condition. And the Overlord of the Mistmoor is kind of leaning further into the token strategy. And yeah, the Lorn of the Third Path kind of points to less need for artifact removal, maybe less Urbresk's Forge, because the console card that we'll eventually talk about, I think, in some form of control deck, kind of negates the Urbresk's Forge strategy. And we'll see here, too, in the best of 3 sideboard that they did just lean into the Exercise as well, so instead of Lorn of the Third Path. So the lands, though, really quick, this one is dropping the Elegant Parlor. If you do see Elegant Parlor in a mono-white token control list, it's because they're running Imidane's Recruiter in the sideboard. This one is not running that. Imidane's Recruiter, the haste really helps up against Sunfall in Domain, especially, or in the mirror match. And we're bringing in 3 planes and a Sunken Citadel for the in place of the Elegant Parlor, which is the white-red tap land surveil land. And Imidane's Recruiter got cut from the list, like I mentioned, as well as Lorn of the Third Path, and 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown. So we still have 1, but not running 2. And instead, we're running the 3 copies of Exercise, and this being kind of like a Destroy Evil, hitting power instead of toughness, but giving you artifact and enchantment hate at sorcery speed is pretty excellent. And then I was actually surprised it took this long for Exercise to really come in more strongly into the sideboard, because it just read like a really strong card, right? And running Split Up instead of the Temporary Lockdowns, being able to hit stuff that is more than just mana value 2 or less, depending on the tapped, untapped situation. Oh, dagnabbit, I forgot again. So I don't always talk about the ladder, but I heard some people really appreciated it, so I'm going to keep doing it. As far as mono-white token control does on the MTG Arena ladder, it is favored against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus and mono-black Midrange. Now, remember, favor does not mean guaranteed to win. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange and Gruul Aggro, and it is weak to Domain. Now, depending on how you sideboard it, you can dramatically change things, so take that with a grain of salt. That is the average mono-white token control deck for the average player on the Arena ladder. Number 2 here is Dimir Midrange by Rotor Erzangel. Took down 2nd place on Friday, and again, this one's also an archetype that we've seen prior to Foundations. Deciding to drop depending on what list you want to compare it to, because last week I covered there were 4 Dimir Midrange lists, but compared to one of them, deciding to run Kaido, 2 copies of Kaido instead of 3, dropping the Urtai Resurrected, dropping 1 copy of the Mockingbird to bring in 1 copy of the Preacher of the Schism, 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, and dropping the Phantom Interferences, instead running the Spell Stutters, and bringing in 1 copy of the 3 Steps Ahead. And the best of 3 sideboard, so all in all, just a very similar deck. The general strategy of this deck is to get in early with Evasive Flyers and use either Gix Yawgmoth Praetor or Enduring Curiosity to turn the early evasion into card advantage. And then synergies to boot, right? Early interaction and the counterspell to prevent your board from getting wrathed. And some run the Slasher, some don't as well. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, we see Akelzot's Deepest Betrayal getting dropped, as well as a Ghost Vacuum. So we're still running 1 copy of Ghost Vacuum, but not 2. That might be because there was less Azorius Oculus on the ladder. It's also not just like a game-winning card against Azorius Oculus. A better Azorius Oculus player, and these guys are like top of, they play this game a lot, can work around the Ghost Vacuum and get 6 cards into the library so that you can just hard cast the Oculus, for example. The 1 less Harvester of Misery, which kind of points to less Jeskai Convoke or less Boros Convoke, and 1 less Malicious Eclipse, which also points to that. Jeskai Convoke and Boros Convoke being the go-wide strategies in the past that have kind of fallen off in popularity as well. And although they pop up every once in a while, right? The Anoint with Affliction, bringing in an additional Anoint with Affliction, giving you that exile, especially useful against like the Heartfire Hero and the Gruul Aggro decks. Gix's Command kind of being a sweeper, the 5-costed sweeper that also gives you the lifelink, can be very good in stabilizing in certain matchups. And we've also got the 3rd copy of Kaido, Bane of Nightmares in the sideboard. And 1 Shieldred the Apocalypse, which is a nice one to stabilize against other aggro matchups. So the matchups for Dimir Midrange on the ladder in Arena, it's favored against Golgari Midrange, and it's favored against Mono Black Midrange. It's a coin flip against Domain and Azorius Oculus. I was surprised to see that it was a coin flip against Domain because at the higher levels of play, it's one of the reasons why Domain just wasn't on the ladder was because of Dimir Midrange. So again, this depending a little bit based off of whether or not we're talking about the top tier level of play or not. And then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Gruul Aggro, which I agree with entirely. Rakdos Lizards can give this deck problem as well. Just anything that has a faster pace, Dimir Aggro can kind of, or Dimir Midrange can kind of struggle against. All right, now first place on Saturday is Golgari Midrange by MTG Holic. And if we compare this one to my last meta review, we can see that they dropped 2 copies of the Caustic Bronco, which has really nice synergies with the Unholy Annex if you can saddle it. Dropped 2 copies of the Tranquil Frillback, and brought in an additional copy of the Glissa Sunslayer and the Sentinel of the Nameless City. And that's why you're going to see these 3 power creatures is to like saddle the Caustic Bronco. So it's a little interesting to see Caustic Bronco being dropped down to 2, but keeping the Sentinel of the Nameless City. But these guys know what they're doing. So we're also bringing in 4 copies of the Land of War Elves. So again, a slight nod to Foundations. One of the ones definitely going to find some play in Domain, Golgari, that sort of thing. And 2 copies of the Scavenging Ooze, which gives you excellent graveyard hate, life gain, and just becomes this like must-answer threat eventually if you're trading creature-centric strategies, filling the graveyard with creatures. So 1 additional Sentinel of the Nameless City, again, for usually for the Caustic Bronco synergy, but dropping the Dreams of Steel and Oil, again, another point that like maybe there's less Urabrask's Forge in the meta, at least in the high level of play, and dropping 2 copies of Duress. If you're coming up against a lot of Urabrask's Forge, you'd probably not want to drop the Dreams of Steel, Oil, and the Duress, just so you know. And then Anoint with Affliction, dropping 1 copy down there to bring in the 4th copy of the Unholy Annex. If I remember correctly, this was the Worlds list that I'm comparing it to, that wasn't running a full 4 of the Unholy Annex. And dropping a Swamp and an Underground Mortuary to just bring in 2 more Forests. So the best of 3 sideboard is dropping the 2 copies of the Choking Miasma. Again, that's the go wide answer for Boros Convoke or Jeskai Convoke. Dropping the Dreams of Steel and Oil, Urabrask's Forge hate, dropping the 2 copies of Ghost Vacuum, which is the Azorius Oculus hate, and dropping 1 copy of the Nissa Ascended Animist, which is the artifact and enchantment hate, as well as an overrun of style effect. Can also be good against white Wraths that, like, Planeswalkers don't get affected by Wraths. Let's see, and then as far as the cards that we are bringing in, we've got the Akelzot's Deepest Betrayal, helps stabilize against aggro matchups, and can punish kind of decks that have little exile removal. And we're bringing in the sideboard the 4th copy of Cutdown. Again, against aggro, you'd bring this in. Bringing in an additional copy of Duress, which you'd bring in against Azorius Control or Domain, and any of the control strategies. And an additional copy of Harvester of Misery, so this would be the answer to Boros Convoke or Go Wide strategies. And then 1 copy of Vivian Reed, and this one's kind of just the Planeswalker. It still gives you the artifact and enchantment hate like Nissa does, and kind of gives you that same kind of good against white Wraths and control. If your opponent is weak against Planeswalkers, or if you need the artifact or enchantment hate, you could bring in the Vivian Reed. And the upside too is that you can destroy a creature with flying, which works nicely against the like Unholy Annex in mono black. or in Golgari Midrange in the mirror match. Oh, almost forgot. Okay, so Golgari is one that has been very popular on the arena ladder, and it hasn't been performing particularly well, probably because of how popular it is, or maybe it's just not being. Maybe it's not being piloted perfectly, right? So it's a coin flip against Gruul Aggro and Mono Black Midrange, and then it is weak to Mono Red Aggro, Mono White Control, Domain, Dimir Midrange, and Azorius Oculus. Now, it's not unwinnable, right? But for most people, it's kind of an uphill battle. If you are playing the deck at the top levels of play, then it's much closer to a coin flip for a lot of you play Golgari Midrange as a popular tournament pick because it is a coin flip against a broad spread of decks and really comes down to how well the pilot can manage the situation, rather than a different strategy which would be more designed to prey on a specific deck being played, right? So you're kind of playing the spread with the Golgari Midrange, which is why it's a very popular choice. But it's definitely not the best deck to climb with on arena ladder, in my opinion. Might be an unpopular opinion, but I think it's what the stats show. All right, here we go. Second place here on the 16th was Dimir Midrange by Rem F, and so I think, is this the second? No, this is okay. So there's two tournaments on Saturday. So one of them was taken down second place by Rem F, who's a master of Dimir Midrange. In my meta review, we were actually talking about Rem F's list last, so I'll just compare it to that one. They dropped the Airtie Resurrected, the Flood Pits Drowner, Mockingbird, Tashana's Tidebinder, and the 3 copies of the Unstoppable Slasher, and instead is bringing in a full playset of the Preacher of the Schism, which is a great mid-range threat. I really like the Preacher of the Schism. 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, and 1 Gix's Command starting in the main. Usually we see this more as a best of 3 sideboard. Kind of depends on what the expected matchup is. 3 Steps Ahead, bringing in 1 copy of the 3 Steps Ahead. And the lands are Restless Reef and a Swamp, and an Underground River getting dropped for an island and an Undercity Sewers. So going down a little bit in lands. The best of 3 sideboard is dropping the Blotout, which is an answer to Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, which again, we're seeing kind of people dropping the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, so you don't need the Blotout as much. Gix's Command, it also works well in the mirror match against Enduring Curiosity, because Blotout gets rid of it, exiles it, permanently gone, and this tends to be one of the higher cards that's showing up in Dimir Midrange. Gix's Command is getting dropped from this list, or 1 copy is, and Negate getting dropped, as well as 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, which got moved to the main. And well, thank you there, Spaden. I forgot to turn off my alerts. All right. Okay. So where was I? Anoint with Affliction came in. 1 copy of Ghost Vacuum came in. 1 copy of Kaido, Bane of Nightmares, is moved to the sideboard, and 1 Phyrexian Flesh Gorger. And I really like this inclusion because this punishes the decks that are running the full playset of Go for the Throat, right? So you bring in that artifact creature to make them have kind of a dead card. All right. On the second tournament, first place was taken down by Domain by Frisky Frasca. And this is the first time that we've been able to talk about the Zur Enchanter deck in this meta review. So it's been around for a little bit. It's definitely, if you go back in time, you look back in Duskmourn, I think I did talk about it in one of the standard challenges. But basically, your Zur allows you to turn a non-aura enchantment into a creature, which allows you to animate your busted overlords, which are sitting there as enchantments, and then you turn them into creatures, and this is not until end of turn, right? This is just, they become creatures. And they also have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. So it's pretty disgusting. So it leans more heavily into the Overlord synergies than some other Domain lists do. It still has the Herd Migration and the Leyline Binding, which works really well off of the Domain land that you get from Overlord of the Hauntwoods. Up the Beanstalk also triggers a card draw when you impede any of these because they count as playing a mana value of the card. So if you if you do the impending for one in a double pip green, it's casting a 5 mana costed spell, and you draw off of Up the Beanstalk. The interaction then is Get Lost, and this one's running the Scroll Shift, and then the Temporary Lockdown, and eventually Sunfall also for your kind of like end-all sweeper. So this one is favored against Golgari Midrange, and is part of the reason why we saw Golgari Midrange fall out of popularity long ago, was because Domain was very popular. Can stand behind that one. It's also favored against Azorius Oculus and Mono White Control, and it's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange and Mono Black Midrange. I think it's an unfavorable coin flip against Dimir Midrange, if it is one. And then it's weak to Gruul Aggro and Mono Red Aggro, which makes sense. You have limited amount of interaction for early pressure. So the best of 3 sideboard has Elspeth's Smite to bring in against aggro to help you against that early pressure, Ghost Vacuum to help up it against Azorius Oculus and any graveyard-centric strategies, Negate for non-creature spells and control. Doppelgang is an alternative win condition if they're really good at shutting down your creature-based strategy. Not on my watch for aggro and removing problematic attackers. Pop Hatch Formation works really well against anything that you need the enchantment hate, so Up the Beanstalk in the mirror match and Domain. It's also useful against Unholy Annex, being able to kill the demon or the enchantment. And then you can also use it in a pinch against aggro to draw a card and create a food token. Usually you're not going to want to bring that in as a sideboard for a aggro specific matchup, but you can use it in situations where it's a dead card and you're not finding a good target for it. It's kind of an alternative that you don't really want to be using. But and then we have the third copy of the Temporary Lockdown, which also helps out against certain matchups if they're very low to the ground. Ooh, okay, I've been rambly today. Here we go. Second place was Azorius Oculus by Gracias Portanto. Took down second place on the 16th, and it took down first place on the 17th. So this is where I was talking about the unsummons. So we're gonna see unsummon, I think, being explored in this archetype, and also we're gonna see the opt potentially. Maybe not. We'll see. But opt is definitely one that's being explored. So Kira, the Rising Tide, is I think an interesting inclusion into this deck because it does allow you to kind of have a chart a course effect where you can then draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. And this deck is really good at turning on Threshold. So I thought the exploration of Kira was really was interesting. And not sure it's here to stay because they did decide to drop Kira tomorrow's deck we'll talk about here shortly, but to make room for it they brought out the sleight of hands, which is the opposite of what we're seeing in best of 1, which makes me skeptical about the chart of course and sleight of hand decision that I was talking about earlier, because I tend to weight what's happening in best of 3 more highly than what I'm seeing in best of 1. Not always, but I wouldn't be surprised if later down the road we see in best of 1 the chart of courses come back, right? Something to keep an eye on just to see whether or not I'm right or wrong. This one is running 3 copies of Recommission, giving you more stuff to be able to actually have hits for enabling your graveyard. Downside is when you have a bunch of reanimation and you miss your targets in the graveyard. But this one's dropping the Into the Floodmaws because the unsummons are basically the Into the Floodmaws, and we're dropping the 3 copies of the Phantom Interference, as well as the Soul Partitions, the 3 Steps Ahead, and bringing in Get Lost. Again, kind of the opposite of what we saw in best of 1, and bringing in a Moment of Truth, and the 4 unsummons and the 4 founding of the Third Path. And this one's more best of 3 than it is best of 1, just because you have more time in best of 3, less aggro matchups. Games tend to go a bit longer just because they don't have the hand smoothing that does the hidden mulligan that Wizards of the Coast has been talked about openly about. It does exist in best of 1. It's not necessarily a hidden mulligan, but it's sort of like that effect. It changes your opening, how many lands you're expected to have in your opening hand, which then favors aggro, encourages the speed of aggro, and does not exist in best of 3, which then makes the cards like Founding the Third Path, which take a little bit more time, are a little bit more playable. So I hope that it kind of explains why you see some differences between best of 1 decks and best of 3. The lands got tweaked with the Darker Waste, came down 1. We brought in an additional Flood from Verge and an additional island. So the sideboard here, we dropped the Elspeth Smites, we dropped the Fairy Mastermind, we dropped the 1 copy of the Monastery Mentor, and the 3 copies of the Temporary Lockdown to bring in 3 copies of Exercise. Again, we're going to see this, I think, just replace basically Destroy Evil, giving you that artifact and enchantment hate, while also being able to create destroy a large creature. And then we have 1 copy of Get Lost, and 3 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts, and I like this inclusion. I think that there are certain matchups where the Sheltered by Ghosts can just win you the match, right? It depends on how much interaction that your opponent is running. So this can give you some lifelink, which really can help stabilize against the pressure, and can kind of can help stabilize against certain matchups. And then we have 3 copies of Split Up, which is the alternative to Temporary Lockdown. Being able to destroy them instead of exile can be important. And I was actually, this was another speculation that I had of whether or not Split Up was actually just going to replace Temporary Lockdown. And I think a mixture is usually what we see, but Gracias por Tanto decided to lean fully into it, and I love to see it. All right, I won't forget this, I swear. Okay, it's favored against Golgari Midrange. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, Gruul Aggro, and Mono Black Midrange. Again, this is best of 3 specifically. It is weak to Domain, Mono White Control, and Mono Red Aggro. Okay, first place on the 17th was taken down by Gracias por Tanto with the very close to the same list, deciding to drop Kiora the Rising Tide on the Sunday's tournament to bring in 1 copy of Negate. And the best of 3 sideboard also had a very small change, which was to bring out that 1 Negate, bring out 1 Split Up, and bring in the Temporary Lockdown. So deciding to not just lean fully on the Split Up. Mixture is probably better after all. And bringing in 1 copy of the Disdainful Stroke, which, by the way, this same reason that the Up the Beanstalk triggers off of the Impending on Domain, Disdainful Stroke you can use to counter the impending effects of your opponent's overlords. So it's like a domain-specific card. It's been a domain-specific card because it counters Leyline Binding, Herd Migration, Sunfall, and Atraxa, right? All right, I think I got it done in under an hour. It was close, man. This was a long one. All right, so Gruul Aggro by Mana Lachao was second on the 18th. And this one's really easy. They replaced the 4 copies of Shock with the 4 copies of Burst Lightning. This is the thing that I think we're going to see. You're going to replace all of the copies of Shock with Burst Lightning because it's just a strictly better Shock. And then if you want Shock as well, then that's the question, right? Do you run Burst Lightning and Shock? The best of 3 sideboard is exactly the same as I covered in my last best of 1, best of 3 meta review. So just especially because we're low on time, I'm just going to skip it. And but it is here for you. And it is favored. Gruul Aggro is favored against Dimir Midrange and Domain. It's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus and Mono Red Aggro, and it is weak to Mono Black Midrange, which, for the same reasons as I talked about in Best of 1, the interaction, the Mono Black spot removal is able to slow this deck down and disrupt its early aggression. So I hope that finds you well. I hope that helps you understand what's happening in Best of 1 and Best of 3 in a more on a deeper level. If you have any questions, if I misspoke, feel free to point it out to me in the comments below. And I will be back next week to see if there's been more substantial changes to Foundations. Again, this will be a strictly informative podcast based off of the data. So only time will tell. And yeah, with that, take care, everybody. I will be posting some of my drafts. Been doing some Best of 3 Foundations drafts for those who like that sort of thing. And on Sunday, I will be doing my Best of 1 Meta Breakers. And I'm going to open up things next week to the community deck tech. So if you have something that you would like to post to the community deck tech, that will be available on Tuesday this week, so that we'll cover it next week on the following Tuesday. So thanks for being a part of my community. Take care, everybody, and enjoy Foundations.